I was 62 when I heard my daughter-in-law ask why I was still around. It was late August in Franklin, Tennessee, one of those humid backyard evenings when the air holds onto the day's heat long after the sun disappears. The yard smelled like charcoal smoke, citronella candles, and damp grass that hadn't quite cooled down yet. My son Daniel and his wife Vanessa were hosting one of their usual weekend gatherings in the backyard of the house I had once helped them buy. String lights hung across the fence. Folding tables were covered with plastic tablecloths that lifted slightly in the warm breeze. Someone had set a Bluetooth speaker on the patio, and music was playing just a little too loud for conversation, and just a little too cheerful for the mood of the people sitting beneath it. I had brought peach cobbler. I remember that detail clearly because the dish was still warm in my hands when I stopped beside the wooden side gate and heard Vanessa laugh. It wasn't a big laugh. That's the part people misunderstand when they imagine cruelty. They think it arrives with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it slips out quietly, wrapped in a tone just casual enough that everyone pretends it meant nothing. "Honestly," she said, "why is she even still around?" Then someone laughed with her. A second later, I heard Daniel laugh too. Not loudly, not for long, just enough. I stood there, holding that cobbler dish with both hands, staring at the knot in the fence in front of me, as if it might explain what I had just heard. For a moment, I noticed small, strange details. A mosquito landing lightly on my wrist, the faint smell of lighter fluid from the grill, the way the top hinge of the gate had begun to rust around the screws. At the time, I didn't think much about those things. Later, I understood. My mind had simply gone looking for smaller details it could manage. I could have turned around. That would have been the obvious reaction. It would have made sense. But some people mistake silence for permission. And over the years, Daniel and Vanessa had slowly come to believe that about me. So I opened the gate and walked into the yard. No one greeted me right away. That part mattered more than the words I had overheard. When a group knows something uncomfortable has been said, even if no one acknowledges it, the air shifts slightly. A woman near the patio table stopped mid-bite and looked down at her plate. One of Daniel's neighbors adjusted his lawn chair for no reason at all. Vanessa was the first to turn. Her smile appeared quickly, the way a porch light flicks on from inside a house. "Oh," she said. "Evelyn, we didn't know you were coming." I lifted the dish slightly. "I brought dessert." She didn't move to take it. Daniel glanced over from the grill. He held a pair of tongs in one hand and a beer in the other. He gave me the same small nod people give delivery drivers or distant acquaintances. "Hey, Mom." That was all. No one offered to clear space for the cobbler. No one stepped forward to take the dish. I set it down myself beside a bowl of pasta salad and a tray of hamburger buns. Then I found an empty folding chair near the far end of the table and sat down carefully. The chair creaked slightly under my weight. My back had been bothering me that week, but I sat up straight anyway. The yard buzzed with small conversations and laughter. Daniel moved easily among the guests, lifting the grill lid every few minutes, as if the fire itself answered to him. Vanessa floated between groups, holding a bottle of white wine, wearing the polished expression she used whenever she wanted everything to look pleasant from the outside. My grandchildren ran across the yard with sparklers someone had handed them. One of them brushed past my chair. He didn't stop. He didn't say hello. For a moment, I wondered if he even recognized me, without the grocery bags or the small gifts I used to bring. I used to keep gummy worms and stickers in my purse for those children. That night I might as well have been another patio chair. At some point, Daniel tapped his glass with a fork and stood near the grill. "To family," he said, raising his beer. Glasses lifted around the yard. They clinked together lightly. No one looked at me. That's when the room went quiet inside me. Not outside the yard was still full of laughter and music and the sound of forks scraping paper plates. But something inside my chest cooled all at once. Not anger, not even heartbreak exactly. More like a filing drawer sliding open somewhere deep in my mind. Vanessa leaned down near my chair a while later. I can't remember exactly when, maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer. Time behaves strangely when something important is unfolding quietly. "Did you want a plate?" she asked. I looked up at her. "I'm fine." She nodded quickly and moved away before I finished the sentence. I stayed until the end of the evening. That surprises people when I tell it now, though I don't tell it often, but I stayed. I helped stack the paper plates when guests began drifting toward the house. I gathered napkins that had blown across the grass. I wiped one corner of the folding table with a damp paper towel because barbecue sauce had spilled there, and no one else seemed inclined to deal with it. At one point, I carried my empty cobbler dish into their kitchen and rinsed it in the sink, while Vanessa stood at the island talking about school zoning and summer camps. She didn't introduce me to the woman she was speaking with. Daniel never came inside to talk to me. Not once. When I finally left, the dish was empty and the sky had gone dark. Cicadas hummed in the trees behind the fence. I placed the cobbler dish in the passenger seat of my car out of habit before realizing there was nothing left inside it. I drove home slowly. My house sat in the eastern part of Franklin, a brick ranch I had lived in for more than 40 years. The porch light came on automatically when I pulled into the driveway. My husband Walter had been gone 11 years by then, but the house still held the quiet rhythm we built together. The hydrangeas near the mailbox had grown too large for their beds. The hallway floor still creaked outside the linen closet. I kept a ceramic bowl near the door for keys, even though mine were usually the only ones dropped into it. Inside, the house was still. I set the cobbler dish in the sink. I changed out of my blouse. Then I stood at the kitchen counter, drinking a glass of cold water, while the refrigerator hummed softly behind me. After a while, I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and took out a small spiral notepad. I wrote 4 things: the date of the barbecue, the exact phrase I heard. Who laughed? Daniel present. I stared at those words for a long time. At the time, I told myself I was writing them down because memory can blur when emotions get involved. But that wasn't the entire truth. The truth was that some part of me already understood this wasn't simply about hurt feelings. It was about pattern. About what people allow themselves to say when they believe your role in their life is permanent and powerless. The next morning, I made coffee in my smallest pot. That was the first quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. I sat at the kitchen table by the window, the same place where Daniel used to do his homework when he was in middle school, his knees bumping the underside of the table because he had grown too tall for the chair. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A lawn service truck passed around 9. A dog barked twice down the street. Sunlight slid slowly across the oak tabletop, catching the small scratches Walter left years ago when he repaired a cabinet door without laying down enough protection. My eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the spare room, toward the file cabinet. The house Daniel lived in, now the one with the backyard and the string lights and the toast to family, had not been purchased entirely with his own savings. 12 years earlier, when mortgage rates were shifting and Daniel called, sounding hopeful and slightly embarrassed, I had transferred $35,000 from my retirement account to help with the down payment. At the time, I didn't think of it as sacrifice. I called it helping. There is a difference. Sometimes you only understand that difference years later. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and walked down the hallway. The spare room smelled faintly of cedar and printer paper. I kept old tax files along one wall and gift-wrapping supplies in the closet. A grey metal filing cabinet sat under the window. The top drawer stuck slightly when humidity rose. That morning it resisted just enough to irritate me. I pulled out the folder labelled in my handwriting, Daniel, House. There are few sounds more clarifying than paper opening when you are no longer afraid of what you might find. Inside were the purchase documents, the wire transfer confirmation, copies of emails, and the letter I had signed stating the funds were a gift, with no expectation of repayment. I remembered Daniel standing in this same kitchen years earlier saying, "I just don't want anything to feel awkward later." That sentence returned to me so clearly that I had to sit down. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. I read every page. My name appeared nowhere on the deed. Of course it didn't. I had known that all along. But knowing something casually and seeing it printed in ink are two different experiences. Daniel Mercer, Vanessa Mercer, joint tenants with rights of survivorship, clean, complete, legally tidy. I placed the papers in my lap and looked out the window at the backyard. The bird feeder hung slightly crooked. I had been meaning to fix it for months. There was no legal path back through that house. I understood that immediately, but another realization followed close behind. If I could not reclaim what I had already given, I could still decide what remained. That was the first procedural thought I had. Not anger, not revenge, just a quiet question. What still has my name on it? By noon, the dining table was covered with documents. My reading glasses rested low on my nose while I wrote categories on the notepad. Property, accounts, beneficiaries, medical authority, durable power of attorney, insurance, access. I wrote each word slowly. Then I drew a line beneath them. Under the line, I wrote one final sentence. Start with documents. That afternoon, Daniel texted me. "You okay? Vanessa thinks maybe she upset you Saturday. Long day. Don't take it personally." I read the message twice. Then I turned the phone face down on the table. He wasn't asking what happened. He was asking whether I would perform the role I had always played, absorbing the discomfort so everyone else could remain comfortable. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the hall closet and pulled down the fireproof document box from the top shelf. Inside were my most important papers, the deed to my house, insurance records, my will, and one document I had not looked at for nearly 2 years. Daniel's name on my power of attorney. The lawyer looked up and paused. That moment would come later. But even then, standing alone in my hallway, I knew something had already begun. By 5 o'clock, I had made one decision. I was not going to argue with family about what I heard in a backyard. I was going to verify every piece of authority connected to my name. And once I started, I wasn't going to stop. That evening, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Her name was Marlene Bishop. She had worked in probate administration for nearly 20 years before retiring. We knew each other from church committees and community events. Marlene was the kind of woman who ironed pillowcases and read every page before signing anything. When she answered the phone, I almost changed my mind. Instead, I said, "Marlene, I need to ask you something about estate documents and financial access." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, "Bring everything tomorrow." After the call ended, I stood in the kitchen holding the phone. Outside, the evening light had turned soft and blue. Inside, something unfamiliar had settled into place. Not peace exactly, but order. And sometimes order is the first mercy you receive. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, not because I felt anxious. That surprised me a little. I had expected a restless night, the kind where thoughts circle endlessly and sleep comes in fragments. But instead I had slept straight through until dawn, the way people sometimes do when their minds quietly settle on a direction. At 6:30, the house was still. The sky outside the kitchen window held that pale grey colour that appears just before the sun commits to rising. I made coffee in the small blue pot again. The larger one remained untouched in the cabinet. Little adjustments like that happen gradually when a household becomes quieter. At first, they feel temporary. Later, you realize they are simply the new rhythm. I spread the documents across the dining table again. Power of attorney, my will, insurance beneficiary forms, bank statements. A copy of the wire transfer from 12 years earlier. I organized everything into 3 neat stacks. Marlene would appreciate that. She had always believed clarity begins when the chaos leaves the table. While I worked, a memory drifted in unexpectedly, not a dramatic one. Just a small morning scene from years ago. Daniel was maybe 7 years old, sitting at this same table with a bowl of cereal that had already gone soggy. His feet didn't reach the floor yet, and he was swinging them under the chair in a slow, restless rhythm. "I'm not going to school," he said. I remember standing at the counter with a dish towel in my hands. "You are," I told him calmly. "No," he insisted, shaking his head hard enough that milk splashed over the rim of the bowl. "Why not?" "Jimmy Parker said my backpack looks like a baby one." I wiped the milk with the towel and slid the spoon back toward him. "Well," I said, "Jimmy Parker doesn't get to run your life." Daniel stared down at the cereal like it had betrayed him. "What if everyone laughs?" I remember answering without thinking very long. "Then you keep walking." At the time, it felt like ordinary parenting. Later, sitting at that same table decades later with a stack of legal papers in front of me, I realized something quietly. Somewhere between elementary school and adulthood, Daniel had stopped believing that advice applied to him. Or perhaps he had simply learned a different version of it. Sometimes people decide it's easier to laugh with the crowd than keep walking past it. I finished organizing the documents and placed everything carefully into a large folder. At 9:15, I drove across town to Marlene's house. She lived near the older courthouse district, where the streets were narrower and lined with crepe myrtles that dropped pink petals onto the sidewalks like confetti. No one bothered sweeping up. Her brick house sat on a quiet corner lot with a tidy porch and wind chimes that made a soft, metallic sound in the breeze. When she opened the door, she was wearing the same navy cardigan I remembered from church meetings. In one hand, she held a mug that read, "Trust, but verify." "Come in," she said. Her living room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and peppermint tea. Sunlight slipped through the blinds in thin stripes across the coffee table. The room looked exactly the way Marlene lived, her life orderly without being stiff. I placed the folder on the table. "I'm not entirely sure what I'm looking for yet," I told her. She gave a small shrug. "That's normal." She opened the folder and began reading. Marlene had a particular way of reviewing documents. She didn't rush. She didn't flip through pages the way some people do when they assume they already understand the situation. Instead, she read every line slowly, occasionally sliding one paper aside while making a small, thoughtful hum. After about 10 minutes, she said, "All right. Just that." "All right. You gifted the down payment," she continued calmly. "There's no shared title, no repayment clause. Legally, the house belongs to them." "I assumed that," I said. She nodded. "But that's not really the question you came here with." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I watched her turn the next page. "The power of attorney." She lingered there longer. "This document names Daniel as your agent," she said. "Financial and medical authority if you become incapacitated." "Yes. When was the last time you reviewed it?" "About 3 years ago," I said, "after I fell on the porch and broke my wrist." She nodded thoughtfully. "Has he ever used it?" "No." "Has he asked about it?" I shook my head. She leaned back slightly in her chair. "Well," she said quietly, "that's interesting." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" She tapped the document lightly with one finger. "Because authority documents aren't sentimental keepsakes," she said. "They're operational tools." I sat with that sentence for a moment. Operational tools. Daniel had never once asked where those papers were kept, never asked how to access accounts, never asked whether anyone else needed copies. He had simply accepted the title, like a certificate you hang on a wall but never actually read. Marlene turned another page. My will. She read it carefully. You left the house to Daniel, she said. Yes. And named him executor. Yes. Everything else split between Daniel and your grandchildren. Yes. She set the paper down and looked at me over her glasses. Do you want to change that? The question landed softly in the room, but it carried weight. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around her living room. The clock ticked quietly on the wall. A basket of folded blankets sat beside the sofa. A photograph of her late husband rested near the bookshelf. Ordinary objects, familiar ones. For years, I had treated the situation with Daniel as something temporary, a misunderstanding that might eventually smooth itself out. But misunderstandings don't usually include laughter about someone's continued existence. Possibly, I said. Marlene nodded once, as if confirming something on a mental checklist. Good. I looked at her. Good. Yes, she said calmly. Because most people wait until something catastrophic forces their hand. She pulled a yellow legal pad toward her and began writing. If you want to restructure things, she continued, there are 4 areas to examine. She wrote as she spoke. Power of attorney, executor designation, beneficiary alignment, account access. The goal, she said, turning the pad toward me, is clarity. I watched the words for a moment. Clarity. What about the house? I asked. She shook her head slightly. That ship sailed when you signed the gift letter. I nodded. I thought so. But, she added gently, your own property is still entirely yours. That sentence stayed in the room for a moment. Your own property. My house, my accounts, my authority documents, my decisions. It sounds obvious when someone says it out loud. But family has a way of softening those lines until they become difficult to see. Sometimes generosity slowly turns into expectation, and expectation eventually becomes entitlement. Marlene slid the legal pad toward me. You don't have to decide everything today, she said, but you should begin. I folded the checklist and placed it in my purse. On the drive home, I noticed 3 missed calls on my phone, all from Daniel. No voicemail. Just the calls. I didn't return them. Instead, I stopped at the grocery store. The air inside the store was cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. A teenage cashier was ringing up canned soup while talking about a volleyball game with a coworker. A man in a red baseball cap stood in the cereal aisle, comparing 2 brands of oatmeal as if the decision carried enormous importance. Normal life moving along. I bought blueberries, flour, butter. When I got home, I baked a pie, blueberry with lemon zest. The same recipe I used to make every year for Daniel's birthday, until he turned 30 and began saying things like, "You don't have to make a big deal out of it anymore." The pie baked. While sunlight slowly moved across the kitchen floor, I sat at the table with Marlene's checklist and began writing beside each item. Power of attorney revoke. Executor reconsider. Beneficiaries review. Account access audit. I didn't rush. Procedure works best when it stays calm. Around 7 that evening, my phone buzzed again. A text from Daniel. Mom, we're worried about you. Vanessa says you seemed upset Saturday. Call me when you can. I stared at the message for a moment. Then I noticed the wording. We're worried. Not, I'm sorry. That distinction mattered more than he probably intended. I set the phone aside without answering. Later that night, I opened the hall closet and pulled down the document box again. This time, I removed the power of attorney. I held the paper for a long moment. Another memory appeared quietly. Daniel, at 16 in the garage, with grease on his hands after trying to repair the lawnmower engine. This thing is impossible, he had said. Walter laughed softly from the workbench. Machines aren't impossible, he told him. They just require patience. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag. I don't have patience. Walter smiled. You will someday, Standing in the hallway now, I realized something gently. Patience doesn't belong to everyone, but procedure does. I placed the power of attorney into a new folder and wrote one word across the front. Review. Tomorrow I would take the first formal step. Not with anger, not with confrontation. Just paperwork. Because authority doesn't come from speaking first. It comes from knowing exactly where the signatures are, and I knew where to begin. The next morning I ironed a blouse. It was an old habit from my years working in administrative offices, places where people quietly believed appearance reflected competence. The blouse was pale blue, simple and neat, the kind that makes a person look calm, even when they're still deciding exactly what the day will require. I didn't feel nervous. That surprised me a little. If anything, there was a steadiness in my movements that felt almost procedural, like the start of a checklist that had been waiting quietly for its turn. At 9:40 I parked outside a small brick office building where Marlene had arranged an appointment for me. The attorney's name was Andrew Lindell. His office sat between a tax preparation storefront and a dental clinic that always smelled faintly of mint and antiseptic. A narrow metal plaque beside the door read, Trusts, Estates, Elder Law. The lettering had faded slightly in the corners, as if the sign had been quietly doing its job for many years. Inside, the waiting room was calm. A receptionist with silver-framed glasses looked up from her computer. "Good morning," she said politely. "You must be Mrs. Caldwell." "Yes. Mr. Lindell will be with you shortly." I sat down and placed the folder on my lap. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. A pot of artificial orchids rested on a side table beside 3 magazines that looked as though they hadn't been opened in months. At the time, I didn't think much about the stillness. Later, I realized how unusual it is to sit in a place where no one expects you to defend your decisions. When Andrew Lindell came out to greet me, he looked exactly like the kind of attorney people trust before they understand why. Mid-50s, measured voice, a navy tie tied neatly but not obsessively. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, extending his hand. We stepped into his office. I placed the documents on the desk. "I'd like to start with this," I said, sliding the power of attorney forward. He read it carefully, no rushing. No, flipping through pages quickly the way people do when they think they already understand the situation. After a moment, he looked up. "You want to revoke it? It wasn't a question." "Yes." He nodded once. "That's straightforward." He turned his computer monitor slightly so I could see the screen. "This document grants your son Daniel authority to act on your behalf financially and medically if you become incapacitated," he explained calmly. "Revoking it removes that authority immediately." He typed a few keys. "Once the revocation is notarized, any institution receiving the update must recognize the new status." That sentence settled quietly in the room. Must recognize. He printed 2 pages and slid them across the desk. "Read this carefully." I did. The language was simple, clear, final. I signed my name slowly. Andrew Lindell looked up and paused for a moment. That's when everything changed. He pressed the notary stamp onto the paper with a firm, deliberate motion. The sound echoed softly in the room. "Done," he said. The word was small, but it carried a surprising weight. For years, Daniel had held legal authority over decisions he had never once asked about. Now that authority was gone. No confrontation, no argument, just paperwork. Andrew Lindell placed the revocation into a new folder. "Next," he said calmly, "we should review your will." I nodded. He read through the document quietly. "Your son is listed as executor." "Yes." "And the primary beneficiary?" "Yes." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Do you want to amend that?" I thought about Daniel standing by the grill the previous Saturday night, laughing, not loudly, Not cruelly, just enough. Remove him, I said. The attorney nodded without surprise. Entirely? Yes. He opened a blank template on his computer. Then we'll designate a neutral executor, he said while typing. A professional fiduciary service can administer the estate. That felt appropriate. Do that. Understood. He continued entering the changes. And the house? He asked. The question lingered for a moment. My house will go into a living trust, I said. When I pass, it will be sold. And the proceeds? I reached into my purse and removed a small brochure I had picked up during a community event months earlier. Greenway Women's Shelter. He glanced at it and nodded. All proceeds to this organization? Yes. He made another note. You're very clear about this. I've been unclear long enough. He finished drafting the amendments and turned the document toward me. The paperwork already had my name on it. I signed again. Each signature felt less like retaliation and more like alignment. Before I left, he handed me a thin binder. This contains the revocation and the amended estate structure, he explained. Keep it somewhere secure. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. Not because I felt overwhelmed, but because I was noticing something. The absence of noise in my thoughts. No rehearsed explanations. No imagined arguments. Just the quiet understanding that structure had replaced uncertainty. On the drive home, I stopped at First Mutual Credit Union. The building sat on the corner of Maple Street, a plain brick branch with tinted windows and a drive-through that always seemed slightly too narrow for modern cars. Inside, the lobby was nearly empty. A young teller directed me to the branch manager, Patricia Hanley. We sat in a glass office overlooking the lobby floor. I'd like to review the authorized users on my accounts, I said. She pulled up the records. One cosigner and one authorized cardholder, she said after a moment. Daniel Caldwell, yes. She looked up. Would you like to remove him? I would. Her fingers paused above the keyboard. Completely? Yes. She began typing. While she worked, I noticed a small plant sitting near the corner of her desk. A trailing pothos with glossy, heart-shaped leaves. Daniel had once tried to eat soil from a plant exactly like that when he was 2 years old. Walter laughed so hard he had to sit down on the kitchen floor. The memory passed quietly. Patricia printed several documents and slid them toward me. His access will be removed immediately, she said. New cards will be issued under your name only. Thank you. I signed the forms, another small adjustment. Another piece of authority returning to where it originally belonged. When I stepped outside the bank, the afternoon sun had warmed the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, noticing something unexpected. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean. Like a room after someone opens the windows for the first time in years. That evening, Daniel called again. I let it go to voicemail. Mom, his voice said through the speaker. Vanessa says you've been acting strange. Changing accounts, blocking numbers. There was a pause. Just call me back so we can talk. I lowered the volume. Not because I feared the conversation, but because I had already begun a different one. Later that night, sitting at the kitchen table, I added 3 more items to the checklist. Property trust, account review, security update. Procedure was slowly replacing history, and history had carried too much weight for too long. Outside, the porch light clicked on automatically as dusk settled across the neighborhood. Inside, I poured a cup of tea and opened the binder the lawyer had given me. For the first time in years, the structure of my life no longer depended on someone remembering to respect it. It depended on documents, and documents are patient. The following week moved quietly. Not the kind of quiet that comes from avoidance, but the quieter rhythm of small decisions settling into place one after another. Monday morning, I returned to Andrew Lindell's office. The Living Trust paperwork was ready. He had organized everything into a binder with clean tabs separating each section. Trust formation, property transfer, beneficiary designation, administrative authority. He slid the binder across the desk. "This establishes the Caldwell Living Trust," he said calmly. "Your house transfers into the trust immediately. While you're living, nothing changes operationally. You still control everything. And afterward? After your passing, the trustee liquidates the property and distributes the proceeds according to the instructions you specified." Greenway Women's Shelter. The sentence appeared there in clear legal language. Andrew tapped the document lightly. "Once the deed transfer records, the property will no longer pass through probate." I signed where he indicated. The paperwork already had my name on it. There's a particular stillness that accompanies decisions like that. Not excitement, not grief, just clarity. When I left the office, I noticed the sky had turned the pale, washed blue that sometimes appears after a summer storm passes through during the night. The sidewalks were still damp in places, and the air carried that clean scent rain leaves behind. I stopped at the county recorder's office on the way home. The building sat downtown, a tall beige structure with wide stone steps and glass doors that reflected the street traffic. Inside, the lobby buzzed with the low hum of printers and the soft shuffle of paperwork being passed across counters. A clerk reviewed the trust transfer documents. She stamped them with a mechanical rhythm that echoed softly across the room. Filed, recorded, indexed. Those words appeared in small black letters across the top of the page. Procedure doesn't celebrate outcomes. It simply recognizes them. Outside the building, I paused on the steps and watched a city bus pull away from the curb. A woman across the street struggled with a grocery cart that had lost one wheel. Two teenagers sat on a low brick wall, sharing a pair of headphones. Ordinary life continuing. That evening I received a phone call I had expected sooner. "Daniel." This time I answered. "Mom," he said immediately. "What's going on with the bank?" His voice wasn't angry yet, but confusion was beginning to push its way into the edges. "What do you mean?" I asked calmly. "My debit card stopped working." "Yes. They said I'm not authorized on the account anymore." "That's correct." There was a pause. "You removed me?" "Yes. Why would you do that?" His tone held the kind of disbelief people experience when something they assumed permanent quietly disappears. "I reviewed my accounts," I said. "That doesn't explain anything. It explains the decision." Another pause. In the background, I could hear Vanessa speaking, though I couldn't make out the words. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "Vanessa says you're doing this because of something she said at the barbecue." I took a sip of tea before answering. "This isn't about a sentence. Then what is it about?" "Structure." He exhaled sharply. "That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters." He went quiet. I imagined him standing somewhere in the kitchen of the house I helped fund 12 years earlier, staring at a phone while Vanessa watched from across the room. "You can't just start cutting people out of your life," he said finally. "I'm not." "Then what is this?" "It's clarity." Another silence stretched across the line. "This doesn't feel like clarity," he said. "It feels like punishment." "Punishment would require anger," I replied. "I'm not angry." "Then what are you?" "Finished assuming things will fix themselves." He didn't answer. For a moment, the call filled with the faint hum of connection noise. Then Vanessa's voice rose in the background. "Ask her about the house." Daniel cleared his throat. "What house?" "The one you're living in," I said quietly. "What about it?" I leaned back in the kitchen chair. "That house is yours," I told him. "It always was." "That's not the point." "I know." "Then why bring it up?" "Because sometimes people misunderstand the difference between gifts and obligations." The room on his end went silent. Vanessa must have been listening closely now. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "are you planning something?" The question hovered between us. "Planning?" I repeated. Yes. No. That answer was technically true. The plan already existed. The call ended shortly after that. He said he would figure things out. I wished him well. Later that week, the first social ripple appeared. Kay knocked on my door Thursday afternoon. She held a small container of tomato soup in one hand. I made too much, she said, stepping inside. She sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room thoughtfully. You've been busy, she said. I smiled faintly. A little. She placed the soup container on the counter. Daniel and Vanessa seem unsettled. That happens when structures change. Kay raised an eyebrow. That sounds suspiciously like lawyer language. I spent the week around paperwork. She nodded slowly. Well, the neighborhood grapevine is active. I imagine it is. She leaned forward slightly. Vanessa told someone at the school pickup line that you've been freezing accounts. Interesting wording. Is it true? I updated access permissions. Kay laughed softly. You've always had a way with precise phrases. I shrugged. Accuracy matters. She studied me for a moment. You're calmer than I expected. Why wouldn't I be? Because family conflicts usually come with shouting. Shouting rarely fixes documentation. Kay smiled. That may be the most Evelyn sentence I've ever heard. The conversation drifted to other topics after that. Gardens, local traffic, the upcoming fall festival downtown. But I noticed something quietly while we talked. Kay didn't look concerned. She looked impressed. By Saturday, the financial lane moved again. Andrew Lindell called. The deed transfer recorded successfully, he said. So the house is fully inside the trust now? Yes. And the beneficiary designation? Locked. He paused. No one can alter it without your signature. That sentence mattered. No one. When I hung up the phone, I stood by the kitchen window watching the afternoon light settle across the yard. A squirrel climbed along the fence railing, paused, and then jumped toward the oak tree near the back gate. Small movements, quiet adjustments. Across town, Daniel and Vanessa were beginning to realize something. Authority doesn't come from saying something first. It comes from understanding who actually signs the documents. The tightening began the following week. Not with raised voices, not with accusations, with paperwork. Monday morning, I opened my email and found a message from Andrew Lindell's office, confirming that the trust filings had been accepted by the county registrar. The property transfer had been recorded without issue. My house now existed entirely inside the Caldwell Living Trust structure. The message was written in the plain language institutions tend to use when something is final, filed, processed, effective, immediately. I printed the confirmation and placed it inside the binder. Financial lane. Procedure continuing exactly as expected. The pressure arrived later that evening. At 8:15, my phone rang. Daniel. For a moment, I watched the screen light up on the kitchen counter before answering. Hello. Mom, he said, voice tight. The lender wants updated documentation about the down payment gift. Yes. They're reviewing the original file. That makes sense. No. It doesn't, he replied quickly. They've never asked about it before. I stirred my tea slowly. I imagine they're doing a routine audit. They said something triggered it. That happens. I could hear Vanessa speaking behind him, her voice quick and sharp, though the words themselves were indistinct. Daniel lowered his tone slightly. They want confirmation that the money was a gift. I already signed that letter 12 years ago. I know. Then the documentation already exists. Another pause settled on the line. You're not helping, he said. I'm not interfering. That's the same thing right now. No, I said gently. It isn't. He exhaled slowly, the way people do when they realize frustration isn't producing the response they expected. You're really just going to sit back while this unfolds? Yes. Why? Because the paperwork already says what it says. Daniel didn't answer immediately. I could hear the faint rustle of movement on his end, perhaps him pacing across the kitchen floor. Perhaps Vanessa gesturing impatiently nearby. Houses carry sound differently when tension moves through them. They want confirmation again, he said finally. They said if the lender reclassifies the original transfer, it could affect the loan file. That sounds like something you should discuss with them. You're the one who signed the letter. Yes. So, they may need you to reaffirm it. That's possible. He waited. For a moment, the quiet stretched long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me. Will you? He asked. I thought carefully before answering. I'll review whatever they send. That seemed to surprise him. You're not just going to sign it. I didn't say that. Another silence. Vanessa's voice rose again in the background. What did she say? Daniel covered the phone slightly, but I still heard the whisper of the question. He came back on the line. She says you're doing this on purpose. That's an assumption. It feels like more than that. Feelings and paperwork operate differently, I replied calmly. He let out a short, frustrated laugh. You sound like a lawyer now. I've spent time around them this week. That's exactly the problem. No, I said gently. The problem is that assumptions sometimes run longer than documentation. The line went quiet again. Finally, he spoke. So what happens now? I imagine the lender will send a request. And then? And then I'll read it. That answer clearly did not satisfy him. You could just help, he said. I am helping. How? By allowing the process to follow the rules it already has. The conversation ended a few minutes later, without resolution. But something had shifted. The tone had moved from confusion to unease. Performance was fading. Procedure was beginning to take its place. 2 days later, the financial lane tightened again. A certified envelope arrived from the lender. Inside was a short document requesting updated confirmation regarding the original gift transfer from 12 years earlier. The wording was careful but direct. Confirm that no repayment obligation existed. Confirm that no retained interest in the property remained. Confirm that the gift was unconditional. I sat at the dining table and read the page twice. At the time, I noticed something small. The language did not require me to reaffirm anything. It simply asked whether I would. There is a difference. Later, I would realize how important that difference was. I placed the paper inside the binder and called Andrew Lindell's office. Let's review this before I respond, I said. Of course, he replied. We scheduled a meeting the following afternoon. Meanwhile, the social lane began moving. Thursday morning, I was watering the hydrangeas when Mrs. Turner from across the street walked over. She leaned lightly on the fence. Evelyn, she said gently. Yes? I hope you don't mind me asking, but Daniel stopped by yesterday. That caught my attention. Oh? He seemed upset. I set the watering can down. About what? He said there were problems with the bank and the house paperwork. I nodded slowly. That sounds like Daniel. Mrs. Turner watched me carefully. He asked whether you had been feeling well. I smiled slightly. I'm quite well. That's what I thought. She hesitated. I told him you seemed perfectly normal when we spoke last week. Thank you. She gave a small nod. Well, she added, if you ever need anything, you know where I am. I do. As she walked back toward her yard, I noticed something quietly. Daniel had begun searching for explanations. Health concerns, confusion, perhaps even manipulation by someone else. Those explanations are easier for people to accept than the simplest one. That authority structures had changed. Friday afternoon, I returned to Andrew Lindell's office. He read the lender's letter carefully. Then he leaned back in his chair. They're conducting a file review, he said. That's what Daniel told me. This happens occasionally when mortgage portfolios are audited or transferred. Do I have to respond? No. That answer was immediate. You're under no obligation to reaffirm anything, he continued. The original gift letter satisfied the requirement at the time. What happens if I decline? The lender will rely on the existing documentation, and if they don't, they would need evidence contradicting the original letter, which doesn't exist. Correct. I looked down at the document again. So the system already knows the answer. Yes. Then why ask? He gave a small smile. Because institutions verify. That sentence settled quietly in the room. Institutions verify. He slid the paper back toward me. You may respond if you wish, he said, but you don't need to. I placed the document back in the binder. I think I'll let the existing paperwork speak. He nodded approvingly. That's usually the safest approach. That evening, Daniel called again. This time his voice carried a different tone. Not confusion, not frustration. Something closer to urgency. Mom, he said, the lender sent you a letter, didn't they? Yes. They told me they did. I received it. Did you sign it? No. The silence that followed lasted longer than any we had experienced so far. You didn't, he asked carefully. No. Why? Because the documentation already exists. That's not what they said. What did they say? They said confirmation would simplify the review. Perhaps. So why not just sign it? I paused for a moment, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted him to hear the next sentence clearly. Because clarity already exists. His breathing grew sharper. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No. Yes, you are. No, Daniel, I said calmly. I'm simply allowing the structure to function exactly the way it was written. He didn't respond, but I could hear Vanessa speaking again somewhere nearby. Her voice sounded tense now, a different tone from the barbecue laughter weeks earlier. Finally, Daniel said something quietly. They're freezing our refinance review until this clears. I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see it. That was the first real pressure point. Financial lane tightening. Then I imagine the lender will finish their review soon, I said. You could help speed that up. I'm not slowing it down. You know what I mean. Yes, I replied softly. I do. The call ended shortly after that. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The neighborhood had settled into its evening rhythm. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A car door closed. Wind moved softly through the trees. For the first time since the barbecue, I thought again about Vanessa's sentence. Why is she even still around? At the time, it sounded like casual cruelty. But now I understood something more important. She had asked the wrong question. The real question was never whether I was still around. It was whether the structures I built around my life were still intact. And now they were. Stronger than before. Inside the house, the binder rested on the kitchen table. Every page in it carried my signature. Every decision had passed through procedure. And procedure, once it begins tightening, rarely reverses itself. The following week was quieter. Not because the situation had resolved yet, but because something important had already shifted. The noise that usually accompanies family conflicts, arguments, accusations, emotional appeals never quite arrived. Instead, the tightening continued the way institutional matters usually do. Slowly, formally, and without much conversation. Monday morning, I received another call from Andrew Lindell. Just giving you an update, he said. The lender's review is still active. That's what Daniel told me. They've requested archived documentation from the original loan processor. That seems thorough. It is, he replied, which usually means they're nearing the end of their verification cycle. I thanked him and hung up. The call itself was uneventful, but something in his tone told me what mattered most. The process had moved beyond family discussion. It now belonged entirely to institutions. That changes things. People can argue with relatives. They can't argue with recorded paperwork very easily. Later that afternoon, the social lane returned. Kay knocked on the door again. This time she didn't bring soup, she brought curiosity. "I just ran into Vanessa at the grocery store," she said as she stepped into the kitchen. "And?" She seemed tense. "That happens." Kay sat down at the table and folded her hands. "She asked if I knew whether you'd been talking to lawyers." "That's an interesting question." "What did you say?" "I told her you've always been organized." I smiled slightly. "That's accurate." Kay studied me carefully. "You know the neighborhood is buzzing. I assumed as much. Daniel apparently told someone at the bank that you might be confused about the documents." That detail lingered for a moment. Confused. It's a common explanation people use when they can't quite believe someone else has made a deliberate decision. "I'm not confused," I said gently. Kay laughed quietly. "That's what I told them." She stood up a few minutes later and walked toward the door. "You look different," she said before leaving. "How?" "Settled." After she left, I thought about that word for a moment. Settled, yes. That felt right. The financial lane reached its final tightening 2 days later. Wednesday afternoon, Daniel called again. This time the tension in his voice had changed. Not frustration, something closer to fatigue. "Mum," he said, the lender finished their review. "And?" "They accepted the original gift letter." "That's good." But they flagged something else. I waited. "They said the refinance isn't moving forward right now." "Why?" "They're reassessing our loan structure." "That happens." "They said the file review uncovered some inconsistencies in the refinancing paperwork." He sounded genuinely unsettled now. I didn't interrupt. "They're asking for additional documentation before approving anything," he continued. "That seems reasonable." He let out a long breath. "This whole thing started because they re-examined the down payment." "Yes. And now everything's tangled up in their compliance review." "That sometimes happens during audits." He was quiet for several seconds. Finally, he said something that felt different from our earlier conversations. "Did you know this would happen?" I answered honestly. "No." Another pause. "But you knew something might happen," he said. "I knew procedures sometimes lead to other procedures." "That's not the same thing." "It often becomes the same thing." The silence stretched again. Then he said something quietly. "Vanessa thinks you did all of this because of what she said." I leaned back in the chair. "I didn't do anything to her. That's not how she sees it. People rarely see structure clearly when they expect comfort." He didn't respond. But I sensed something shifting on his side of the conversation. Less accusation. More realization. After a moment, he spoke again. "So what now?" "Now the lender finishes their process. And us? Yes. And you?" I continue living my life. The call ended not long after that. No resolution. No apology. Just a quiet understanding that events had reached a point where conversation no longer controlled the outcome. 2 weeks later, I received the final confirmation from Andrew Lindell. The trust structure had fully settled. My house was permanently assigned to the trust. The beneficiary designation was locked. The executor was a neutral fiduciary service. And the proceeds from the eventual sale would transfer to Greenway Women's Shelter. Everything was now documented. Filed, recorded, irreversible without my signature. I closed the binder and placed it in the fireproof box in the hall closet. For a moment, I stood there in the quiet hallway. The house felt exactly the same. The same creaking floorboard outside the linen closet, the same soft hum from the refrigerator, the same sunlight falling across the hallway carpet. Normal life had returned. That's the thing about structural decisions. They rarely look dramatic from the outside. They simply settle into place. A month later, Daniel stopped by the house. He stood on the porch holding a small paper bag from the bakery downtown. "I brought cinnamon rolls," he said. That's thoughtful. We sat at the kitchen table. For a while, we talked about ordinary things: traffic, the weather, the grandchildren starting school. Eventually, he said something carefully. Vanessa shouldn't have said what she said that night. I looked down at the table. At the time, I didn't feel anger, just recognition. That sentence wasn't the beginning of this, I told him. No, no. Then what was? Years of small assumptions. He nodded slowly. That makes sense. We sat quietly for a moment. Then he said something that sounded almost like the boy who once sat at this table with soggy cereal. I guess I thought things would always stay the same. That's a common mistake. He smiled faintly. Some people mistake silence for permission. The sentence hung between us for a moment. Then I repeated it in a slightly different way. Silence isn't permission, I said. It's patience. And patience, when it finally ends, usually leaves structure behind. Daniel finished his coffee and stood to leave. At the door, he paused. You're doing okay? He asked. Yes. I mean, really okay? I am. He nodded once. Then he walked down the driveway and climbed into his car. The afternoon sun had begun settling across the neighborhood again, the same way it had on countless other days before. Inside the house, everything felt calm, ordered, settled. I poured another cup of tea and sat by the window watching the trees move in the wind. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. Some lessons arrive loudly. Others arrive through documents, patience, and the quiet realization that authority doesn't come from speaking first. It comes from knowing exactly where the signatures are and making sure they belong to you.